Coming up on this episode of Common Denominator.
Your kids, the more you have, the more you realize that your environment is not the only key to their outcome. They bring personalities and perspectives and their own internal worlds to you. And the tendency to believe that we have as much control as we think we have is an overstatement of the fact. Our kids are their own human beings. And if we can actually be curious, get to know them, be interested in what they think and how they see, and not be threatened by it, we will have done a huge service to them.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Common Denominator, where we focus on human connection and what brings us together. I'm Moshe Popak, and I just had a great conversation with homeschooling and critical thinking expert Julie Bogart. We talked about why it's so important for kids nowadays to be critical thinkers and how we as parents could help foster that. And Julie is a big proponent of homeschooling. We talked about the pros and cons and the issues that come up and how to solve them. All in all, super interesting conversation. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. Hi, Julie.
Well, hello, Moshe. Thank you for having me.
Well, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
I know you're a big proponent of kids becoming critical thinkers at a young age. Tell us a little bit about that idea.
I think when we talk about critical thinking, so often we're imagining big political discussions between adults or religious debates. But what I'm really interested in is the way that minds make meaning. And we start generating meanings for ourselves from the time we're born. We start interpreting faces, body language, vocal intonation. We interpret the environment that we grow up in. We make judgments about what is, quote, normal, what is aberrant, what feels comfortable, what's uncomfortable. And these all go to shape our identities and worldviews, which eventually become the floor, the ground floor, the foundation for those beliefs and ideas that we hold dear when we get older. So if we can start to unmask the production of those thoughts, how we arrive at the conclusion of who we are and how we adopt those beliefs and perspectives, we have a better shot at being quality critical thinkers as adults.
I think that's brilliant. I'm a big believer in critical thinking. Whether I like what I find after I dig down, I always say the truth is the truth is the truth, right? And I went to a lecture. a little while ago. Talked a little bit about the idea of we spend kind of our adult life unlearning the conclusions that we learned, right? And in each area, in order to rebuild correctly that radical open-mindedness. So imagine we can do that, and then kudos to you. Imagine we could do that for our children. Right?
Yeah, in fact, I want to challenge even the language of an open mind. What the research shows is that we all come to the table with very full minds. We can be open in the sense of receptive, but I want to just sort of create that little distinction, because sometimes when we insist on someone being open-minded, what we're really saying is the information you have in your mind isn't any good. So can you just open it and receive what I'm teaching you? And that is sort of the model of school, right? There's an authority who is positioned in the front of the classroom, who holds the answer key to the test, to whatever question they're asking, to whatever objectives they have. And then everyone in the room is supposed to adopt the receptivity as though they are coming to the classroom empty. Paulo Freire, who is an education reformer who wrote The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, talks about how we bring tradition, culture, religion, training from our families with us into the classroom. And those understandings actually influence the interpretation we give to any meaningful information that's communicated to us. But so often when we are in a testing situation, we're being called on to set that aside and to pick the answer we think the teacher wants.
Correct.
And a lot of times, kids who are coming from wildly different backgrounds than those of the school district or the teacher cannot even imagine their minds into the worldview of that setting. And they get wrong, quote unquote, wrong answers because they don't have the shared foundation of worldview. So one of the things that we're learning as we do more research into how the mind generates meaning is that our identities and our communities have more to say about our beliefs and what we see as normative than any facts, any data, any research that we might present to someone.
That's super correct. And I just had a conversation with a friend of mine. He called me, and it was a little bit of a tearjerker, actually, because super successful guy, seemingly on the outward, and different people come to me at different points in time, ask advice, and you talk about community. He lives in a certain type of community. I would say more regimented type of community, and he's a very, very passionate about personal growth and development, and he's seeing not just in his social circles, which is hard enough, but even the conversations with his wife, that he's growing and his wife is staying within, rightfully so, maybe within that community, and it's really, really tough.
Oh, yeah.
When you ask many questions, and I implore, I have 10 children. There is, right? It's a lot. I know. There is no wrong question. There is no wrong answer. We have to journey, and even as adults, continue to journey and ask the questions, because who said so? Who said so?
That's actually my second chapter of my book is Says Who. A lot of times we have been trained to think that the omniscient narrator, the dispassionate news deliverer, the information we read on a website is automatically accurate because it is the dominant voice. And so one of the questions I love parents to ask kids at an early age is, who's telling this story? Whose story is not being told? So if you're reading The Three Little Pigs, for instance, it's told from this omniscient viewpoint that favors the pigs. John Sheska wrote this fabulous picture book years ago called The True Story of the Three Little Pigs. And it's by A. Wolf, right? The wolf's perspective. And it completely stands the original perspective on its head with humor, of course, and it's meant to be funny. But it's often the first encounter that kids have with this notion that a story, it has a storyteller. And whether it's a fact that's delivered to us or a bit of data or a website or a person standing in a pulpit or in front of a room at a school, they are bringing with them a perspective. And so early on, we want to create the opportunity to at least acknowledge that there is one and to consider whose perspective is not included in the conversation. So when you're talking about this husband and this wife, this is something I've actually lived. I had quite a bit of inquiry into my religious beliefs in the early 2000s. And my husband at the time was not in a similar place. And one of the things that I discovered very early on is that I was terrified to reveal I was having questions. And that really got me thinking, why? What am I afraid of? I'm afraid of judgment. I'm afraid of disconnection with someone I love. I'm afraid that the community I'm a part of will not like the thoughts I'm having and will kick me out. And so a lot of times these beliefs that we carry with us that feel so familiar and safe are related to that feeling of inclusion and exclusion in our communities and relationships. And that acts as a barrier to giving yourself permission to ask questions that actually lurk inside of you.
If you're just joining us, today we're talking with homeschooling and critical thinking expert Julie Bogart. Next week, my guest will be one of the most well-known plastic surgeons in the country. Dr. Michael Salzauer, aka Dr. Miami, will explore why plastic surgery isn't just for vanity. It can have a profound impact on your self-confidence. So make sure to subscribe to Common Denominator so you don't miss an episode. And if you're enjoying this conversation, please feel free to leave a rating and review. Now, back to the show. I think about spirituality. I think about religious dogma. And I know I'll see people self-sabotage because of within their home environment because of outside society. It just seems that we're deeply social beings, and
We are.
right, and that it's such a deep desire to want to fit in.
Correct. We want to belong. We want a community, but the community shapes our beliefs and our identity. One of the stories I love to tell is when I was growing up in Southern California, it was the 1970s, and becoming a person who was interested in health was really the craze back then. And my family became vegetarian, and we were, I became a runner in my teens. Like, I really cared about physical fitness and health. And across the street from me was a family who was Jewish. They were Orthodox. And I remember going to their house for dinner one night, and they kept kosher. And my friend told me that we were having hamburgers, and I was not allowed to have a glass of milk with my meal. I didn't want the hamburger because I was vegetarian. I did want the milk. And so I got in an argument with my friend's father. I said, but I don't keep kosher, and I'm not eating meat. So the milk and the meat, they're not going to touch. And he said, no, this is our religious practice. It can't even be on the table. It was sort of mind blowing for me at the time. And I learned through that experience that there is another way of thinking about food that had nothing to do with health, that had this religious sort of flavor to it that was deeply meaningful. I watched them through Passover. I watched them changing out all the dishes. And I actually came to really envy kind of the deep meaning they attached to the way that they ate and the way that they conducted their lives. And I think that's part of what we're talking about here. So let's say you're in either of those communities, a vegetarian one, a religious one, and you become the outlier. You decide, well, actually, I am going to start eating meat, or, well, I don't want to keep kosher, but my parents do. What do we do with those moments? Right. How can our relationships make space for change? I won't even call it growth, because you might see it as a step backwards in terms of your own perspective. But part of my mission in this book was for parents to recognize that the family cannot be the community that excommunicates a child who is exercising their thinking skills, starting to evaluate the inputs they've always received with that sort of dissenting voice. I call dissent the chlorine in the pool. It's what keeps us honest. It's what helps us have a healthy family.
And I know my wife and I, we did homeschool our kids, and I know that you had 5 children, which you homeschooled. How did you come to that decision, and how was that experience?
Oh, thanks for asking. So originally, I heard about homeschooling through a group of friends. I was living abroad at the time, and they had decided not to put their kids in the local schools in Morocco. And so then I started reading this homeschooling literature to understand it better, and just fell in love with the idea that I could have this continuous experience of raising my kids and have it uninterrupted. So the same joy I had when my child expressed their first words or took their first steps, I could experience when they read their first book, when we explored history together, which was my major. So it didn't even feel like a decision by the time my kids were school age. I was so bought in. I found the experience really enlivening and enriching. It also changed me. That revisiting of all that material that I had learned as a student myself through the lens of a 30-something adult into my 40s really made me reevaluate some of the assumptions I had made. And I would say that homeschooling led me on a reprise of my academic journey. I eventually went to grad school to solve some of the mysteries that I had raised for myself through reading and learning with my kids. So I found homeschooling incredibly valuable personally and for my kids. Some of them did go to public high school, so we did have both experiences, and I don't have any agenda against public school, except for the way they do testing. I'm not a big fan of that, and I do talk about that in my book.
I'll tell you, you talk about history. My wife said to me the other day, isn't it obvious? The people that actually win are the people that write the history. She said that to me. She talked about critical thinking, right? And it gets me, She gets me. She says, drops things in my mind. And I'm sitting there at 3, 4 in the morning doing research. I'm like, could it be? Is it possible?
Amazing.
And I implore everybody on that idea. The beautiful thing about technology, you have to sift through. I think, you just take the example, right? You can watch, and both opinion news, right? You can watch Tucker Carlson, you can watch Rachel Maddow, and I say do both, and then continue that journey to dig down. And I always like to quote from my grandfather, and always start with this, is the numbers. The numbers never lie. So you start with the stats, but real numbers, real stats, and that's where you go from there. And I call everything else kind of noise, right?
Well, and interestingly, there's one researcher who I just love. His name is Joel Best, and he's written quite a bit about how statistics can be manipulated to create impressions. And so I cite 2 of his key strategies in my book from his book called Stat Spotting, which is a phenomenal little field guide. Basically, he suggests 2 practices that I could share on this podcast. The first one is actually know the measurement tool being used when we are citing a statistic. And then secondly, it's really important to know the benchmarks for that field to ensure that the statistic you're looking at is truthful. It might fit within those benchmarks. So I'll give you a great example. I'm a huge sports fan. I watch all sports, and I grew up playing tennis, love tennis. And so one day my boyfriend's sitting on the couch with me.
You're a good woman, by the way.
Oh.
Tennis fan right here. So, right?
Yeah.
And Dave, our producer here. Dave, huge.
Awesome.
We were just talking about it.
I won my fantasy football league 3 years in a row. I am a true sports fan.
There we go. Wow.
So anyway, I'm scrolling through Instagram and I noticed that Naomi Osaka has served just this killer serve. So I say to my boyfriend, guess what, Jim? Naomi Osaka served a serve of 196 miles an hour. And I was so impressed by it. And he's like, Julie, that's not possible. I said, no, I saw it. I know absolutely it's true. And he's like, Julie, 196 miles an hour would injure you if the ball hit you. There is no way. He's like, men don't serve it that fast. I was like, well, how fast do men serve it? And he's like, John Eisner's fastest serve was 157 miles an hour and no one's ever beat it. And I was like, I know I saw it, though. I know I saw it. So I start scrolling because I'm feeling really insulted that he doesn't believe me.
Right. And
as I'm coming to the Instagram post, he says to me, is there any chance she was playing in the Australian Open? I said, yeah. He goes, do you think they were using kilometers per hour? And I suddenly look, and sure enough, that was the difference. But because I didn't know the benchmarks, I was already passing along misinformation. I literally misread it because my mind and expectations were miles per hour. And so this is an example of what we need to do with statistics. We can't just read them and think we know what they are, particularly if we are outside our own field. Like I am not educated and trained in scientific research methods. So I can get persuaded very easily by 2 different writers around the same issue using their own stats because I don't have enough training. And at that point, it requires a lot more research for me to be able to feel certain before I pass on information.
I'll tell you, I was just speaking with a teacher friend of mine. He teaches 1st grade, and he was saying how the kids coming back now, because during COVID, it's been so choppy. In 1st grade, he doesn't even know where to begin. It's really tough to see the kids. Maybe you can give us some kind of tips. People in regular school, now the kids are going back to school, what are kind of 2 or 3 tips for teachers, for parents dealing with homework, parents to make sure the kids get up on time? What are some of the top 2 or 3 things in your mind going back to school now?
I would say that one of the ways that children experience anxiety is resistance. So a lot of times you'll have a child who is balking, not getting up when they should. They don't want to get on the bus. When they get home, they seem tired and unhappy. And one of the ways that you can soften that experience is to really create a nurturing environment. not discipline. Discipline comes when we feel safe and competent. It isn't something you can impose when somebody is fearful and resistant. So if we want our kids to have a great experience of school, set it up for success, have their best breakfast snack, hang some decorations. I always say party atmosphere. Think of discipline of a party, not the discipline of a courtroom. What is the pleasurable foods they could look forward to when they get home from school? Will you be available to hear what they have to say, to sit with them, to offer them a hug? Maybe start the after school experience playing on a video game and letting them truly unwind and find that emotional regulation. So often we're really focused like a laser on rigor, on discipline, on duty, and a fearful or tired or resistant child is just going to feel worse when we layer those things on top of their school experience.
I think that's brilliant. I think it goes full circle to foundation. My wife and I, we always talk about that. I think my parenting style has really shifted. I think in the beginning, I did a lot of kind of, let me make up for my childhood. Let's take him, buy him this and do that, fun, instead of doing the chores and stuff. And now I really try to look at each child, kind of where they are, and be extremely present and see what they need. Just be a sounding board, being available. And I love that you talk about safety. They have to feel safe in order to thrive.
Yeah. And that connection piece, like you said, taking each child, I have 5 kids, you have double, which is incredible, 10. And maybe that's why we had a lot of kids. I feel like I had to keep practicing and learning. And your kids, the more you have, the more you realize that your environment is not the only key to their outcome. They bring personalities and perspectives and their own internal worlds to you. And the tendency to believe that we have as much control as we think we have is an overstatement of the fact. Our kids are their own human beings. And if we can actually be curious, get to know them, be interested in what they think and how they see, and not be threatened by it, we will have done a huge service to them.
And I know you just came out with an amazing book, Raising Critical Thinkers. What are 2 main points that really kind of stick out in your mind that you want the audience to know?
I think when we think about critical thinking, we focus often on being critical of someone else's thinking, but the foundation of critical thinking is self-awareness. We start by understanding our own biases and paying attention to the signals in our bodies that tell us when we're not thinking well. For instance, one of my signals is smugness. If I'm on Facebook scrolling through and some high school friend posts an article by a person I don't approve of, I end up feeling smug, like I have a superior understanding, and I lose my capacity to imagine how it is for the person who posted that. What need is that meeting? What's at stake for that person? Why is that worldview meaningful to that other person? So critical thinking starts with recognizing your own biases as they kick into gear, and then becoming curious and fascinated by how all of it hangs together for the other person. And then the second step after that is to live alongside another perspective. We can have private thoughts. We don't have to render a verdict on everything we read on the first moment that we read it. We can say, wow, there's a perspective. This is how it hangs together. It now has a chair in the living room of my thinking. But that doesn't mean you agree or disagree yet. You allow it space to kind of do its work in your own world. If we could return ourselves to self-awareness and private thoughts, I think we would grow so much as a culture.
I saw a stat. It was about, I think about agreeing to disagree. Because it said in the early 90s, people would be more open. Maybe it was kind of like 15%. It was just a stat on political, Republican, Democrat. Would you be open to the other person's opinion? Today, it's more like 70% would be shut down.
Truly.
That goes to the core of this podcast, Common Denominator. it's what we focus on, trying to focus on as humans. Because it's for people, this podcast is for people that are just sick and tired of the narrative. And it's for focusing on the things as humans that we have in common instead of the things that we do not have in common. That's literally what it is. And that's what we have to do as humanity.
Yeah. I think it's really an appreciation for difference rather than being threatened by difference, right? It's giving, one example I love to use as parents with kids. It's giving your kids the opportunity to dissent about the little stuff, not the big stuff. So when you call your 8-year-old to the table and you say, go wash your hands, and he says, I don't want to, it's not just moving into parental propaganda program and starting to explain about germs on your hands and how they'll get in your body. It's actually going down the rabbit trail. Tell me more about that. What about washing your hands is a problem for you? Oh, is it the temperature of the water? Let's do some research. Let's actually take the temperature of the water until you're okay with it. Oh, it's not that. It's the texture. Do we want to do hand sanitizer? Could we kill the germs just using a blow dryer and no water at all? Or could we just roll the dice and see if you get sick? Because, that 8-year-old just ate Cheerios off the floor and they didn't get sick. And they watched their mother actually suck the dirt off of a pacifier and pop it back into a toddler's mouth. That 8-year-old is actually challenging a narrative that you don't even maybe believe. So we can't do this every day. We can't do it with everything. Sometimes you got to put the 10 kids in the van and drive somewhere, and you don't have time to go down the rabbit trail of why they aren't in the car seat. But if you can select those moments where dissent appears and you actually become curious and you're not there to tell your child what they should be thinking, you start to teach them that they can stand up for their own thinking and they can collect their own data, do their own research, and draw a meaningful conclusion for them. That, to me, is the heart of what I'm trying to teach in this book.
I think that's truly amazing, Julie. This has been super informative. How can the audience learn more about you, find out about your podcast, get a hold of your book?
Thank you. My podcast is called Brave Writer, like my company. We serve homeschool and traditionally schooled students in the area of reading, writing, and online writing classes. So we'd love to help you out there. My book can be found anywhere books are sold. The book website is raisingcriticalthinkers.com. There is a free book club handout that you can download from there if you decide to read it in a group, which I urge because the ideas are really great when you're in conversation. And you can follow me on Instagram. I'm at Julie Brave Writer. Thank you for having me.
Really a pleasure. Thank you so much. It's been great.
Thanks for listening to the Common Denominator podcast. Join us next week for another inspiring, impactful, and empowering conversation. To learn more about Moshe, head to moshepopak.com. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to share it. And we'd be grateful if you could rate, review, and subscribe to the show.